Hello and welcome back to Futures Leaders Unplugged. I'm your host Archibald, and in this episode, you'll be discussing the East Timorese struggle for independence. The island of Timor is a small island in the Indonesian archipelago. It is currently divided into two parts: the west part of the Republic of Indonesia, and the east, its own country, East Timor, or Timor-Leste. The eastern part of the island, Timor-Leste, had been a Portuguese colony since the 16th century, with the first traders and missionaries arriving on the coast of the island in 1515. Before that, the island was organized into small states ruled by two kingdoms, the Sorbian and Belos. These kingdoms practiced Almonism, a folk religion. The religion of Islam, which was a prevalent religion in the rest of the archipelago, never reached Timor. Even Buddhism, which was extensively practiced in Java, the main island of the archipelago, especially during this time period in the 13th, 14th century, did not reach the island. During the third quarter of the 16th century, the first Portuguese Dominican priests arrived in East Timor and started developing a religious influence in East Timor. Even as Portuguese domination was still being settled, culture developed in the opposite direction from the rest of Indonesian archipelago, including the main islands of Java and Sumatra and the coasts of Kalimantan and Sulawesi. In 1975, with the dissolution of the Portuguese colonial empire, local liberation movements increased. In May 1975, the authorities in Lisbon presented a project to the main Timorese parties. After hearing the project, a law was published on July 11th. This foresaw the nomination of a Portuguese High Commissioner. This same law expected the elections of a People's Assembly in October the same year in order to establish a political system. This law oversaw a 3-year transition period. On November 28, 1975, Fretilin, together with the Prime Minister Javier do Amaral, unilaterally declared independence for Timor-Leste. Nicolau Lobato, who later became the first leader of the armed resistance, was appointed as prime minister of this new independent country. The declaration of independence led to a short civil war. The Indonesian government expressed concern for the growing uncertainty within East Timor and was opposed to Fretilin. On 7th December 1975, Indonesia invaded East Timor. Throughout its occupation of East Timor, the Indonesian government contributed to East Timorese roads, healthcare, and education, but this good work was overshadowed by the destruction of property, crops, and the displacement and deaths of civilians. It is estimated that more than 100,000 to 200,000 East Timorese people died due to conflict between East Timor and Indonesia, occupation, famine, and genocide in the first few years alone. Let me remind you, that is 1/5 of the East Timorese population. On 26th March 1979, the Indonesian government declared East Timor pacified and established a militarized state structure which would administer the territory until 1999. There were a number of shifts in policies and governing the administration of East Timor, which was changed to Timor. However, Indonesian rule relied upon the constant and pervasive presence of the military and the government's ability to minimize international awareness of the situation there. Many East Timorese people remain committed to the idea of national self-determination, yet the shape and form of their opposition changed across the 24-year period of occupation. In 1989, the Indonesian president Suharto visited East Timor and declared the territory would have equal status with other provinces. However, despite this, the Indonesian military's presence remained high, and security forces responded heavy-handedly to growing public expressions of discontent. At the same time, links were being fostered between East Timorese students studying in Indonesia and Indonesian pro-democracy advocates who wanted a broader movement for democratization and political change in Indonesia, which was ruled by a dictator. The common enemy was Suharto's regime, and the common rhetoric was developing and bringing back human rights. The nature of East Timorese resistance changed too. as a new generation of East Timorese who had grew up under Indonesian rule began to express publicly their opposition to occupying regime. A leftist-inspired national liberation movement, the East Timorese resistance, began to appeal more directly to East Timorese people and the international community, and became increasingly adept at utilizing the language of human rights to show their concerns. Many countries, including Australia, effectively looked the other way, prepared to appease Indonesia because of its size and power in the region. For example, in 1978, Australia's Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser was the first to recognize Indonesia's de facto annexation, but the UN condemned it and called for an act of self determination. The resistance. Time went on, East Timor's people began to resist and protest more against the government of Indonesia and the occupying force. The most well known of these protests was the Santa Cruz demonstration, which took place in Dili on 12 November 1991. After a funeral procession of a young student, Sebastião Gomez, Indonesian security forces lined the streets while demonstrators, including many women, marched from Mortael Church to the Santa Cruz Cemetery. Along the way, banners were unfurled, calling for the United Nations to intervene in East Timor, pledging support for the resistance leader Xamana Gustamao, and advocating for East Timor's rights to self-determination. Once the protesters reached the cemetery, Indonesian forces opened fire, killing an estimated 270 young people, while hundreds of others were detained or disappeared in the military crackdown that followed. The massacre was captured on film by a foreign journalist who was present for the planned visit of a Portuguese parliamentary delegation. The footage was smuggled out of the territory in the days following and subsequently broadcast on television stations around the world. These events marked a watershed moment in East Timor's modern history and permanently changed the way international community perceived the Indonesian occupation. This clandestine resistance continued to grow throughout the 1990s, with many young East Timorese taking great risks to deliver information to international solidarity networks and to hold demonstrations when foreign delegations were present in the territory. These changes to the nature of the East Timorese resistance were also impacted by mounting tensions in the Indonesian political landscape. The Asian financial crisis of 1997-90 to 1998 produced high rates of unemployment, and rising food prices exposed the corruption and economic mismanagement of the Suharto regime. This led to mass protests across Indonesia. The popular reformasi movement, which used as its rallying cry the condemnation of corruption, collusion, and nepotism. In Indonesian, korupsi, kolusi, dan nepotisme, shortened as KKN, triggered the resignation of President Suharto on 21st May 1998. Suharto's successor, President B.J. Habibie, was more open to some form of autonomy for East Timor and released Gustamao from prison into house arrest. In January 1999, the new Indonesian president, B.J. Habibie, announced that East Timor could have a wide-ranging autonomy or quick separation from Indonesia. However, his government was unwilling to let UN-led international forces in before he decided how he was going to go about this. It was eventually decided that they were going to have a referendum. In the lead up to the 1999 UN organized referendum, the Indonesian military, known by its initials TNI, was in charge of providing security and keeping militias from intimidating voters. But documents, written orders, telegrams, and radiograms in the CAVR archive show that the military authorities and Indonesian police outfitted and directed pro-Indonesia East Timorese militias to commit violence and intimidate East Timor's independence seekers. During the vote, Indonesian-backed militias tried many times to interfere, assaulting and harassing local and international UN volunteers. Militiamen stabbed a UN volunteer to death. The militiamen also blocked voting offices, refusing to allow UN staffers to take the ballot boxes to the counting center. During and in the direct aftermath of the vote, the militias began targeting local UN volunteers, dragging them out of their homes and assaulting them. At least 14 local UN staff were killed in the weeks after the vote. However, this historic referendum still went on, with 78.5% of East Timorese people rejecting autonomy in favor of independence. Following crisis. However, celebrations across the country were short-lived. Indonesian-backed militia groups who had terrorized the population before the vote stepped up their attacks. Aided by Indonesian security forces, a 3-week campaign of violence killed 2,500 people, with nearly 30,000 displaced and as many as 250,000. That is a quarter of East Timor's population, forcibly shipped over the border to West Timor, where they were put into fake refugee camps. Militias did these actions on a so-called scorched earth policy. The pro-Indonesian militias went on a rampage, assaulting UMAMET, the transfer of rule between Indonesia and East Timor, destroying and forcing Bishop Ximenes Bello to flee to Australia, while Jemana Gustimao, the leader of the resistance, took refuge in the British Embassy of Jakarta. The wave of murders continued, promoted by the anti-independence militia. The Indonesian-backed militias, supported by Indonesian army members dissatisfied with the referendum results, burnt and destroyed over 80% of buildings in East Timor's capital. However, as the country plunged into chaos, East Timor was eventually pacified through foreign intervention and transferred into a non-self-governing territory under a UN transitional administration, with the country East Timor gaining full independence on 20th May 2002. Finally free from occupation, colonization, and the chaos that was in their country over the last years. We have came to the end of our story. I hope you learned more about this tiny island nation of East Timor and how they gained their independence. I hope you come back for the next episode and have a good day. See ya.